Well, hi again, everyone. This is part 2 of my week 2 video, Developing a Thesis Statement. So to follow along with me, again, click on Content up toward the top of our page, then on Course Documents, and then on Developing a Thesis Statement. So you may already know from earlier studies in high school that a thesis statement is a statement. Note, it is not a question. It is a declarative statement that focuses your central ideas into one or two sentences. And everything that you write, everything, should develop around a clear central thesis or main idea. And in fact, if you were to ask yourself what the main point of your paper is, so what is the main point of paper 1, for example, then your answer to that question should resemble the thesis that you've written at in your first paragraph of paper 1. But a thesis statement isn't merely just a statement of opinion, right? It's generally a statement that's going to make an argument. Now, it may be a controversial argument. It may be, an argument that really isn't a big deal. But it must essentially raise a point that is debatable. So even in your first major paper, the summary and response paper, you're raising a point that's debatable. Someone could disagree with you and say, well, you might think that the writing of Eva Derzik is effective and well done, and that, the lost art of writing letters is important, but I would disagree with you. So it's not a super controversial issue like abortion or gun control, for example, but still, your thesis is raising a point that others could disagree with. And also, a thesis will also answer the question, so what? Well, so what about Eva Derzik's text? Or what about Molly Worthen's text that she wrote? Why does it matter? Why is it important? Why should we care about it? So the ideas that I'm going to point out in this document are generalized for the writing of all of your college level papers. And they're generalized more for argumentative or persuasive papers, which is what you will normally be writing in almost all of your college classes. So not everything here applies to the summary and response, and I'll try to make that clear. It's a good idea to go back and read that what is a summary and response and how do I organize it document to just get it clear in your head sort of how this first paper is a bit different from the others that we'll write, and to bear in mind that the generalized ideas here about writing theses may be a little bit different from paper 1. So a thesis statement is going to tell your reader how you will interpret the significance of the topic or the subject or the issue that you're writing about. And so in the case of paper 1, your thesis is going to tell your reader how you're interpreting the meaning of Molly Worthen's piece, or the meaning of Eva Derzik's piece and the writing of that piece, whether it was done well, whether it was not done well, whether you agreed with it, the ideas within it, whether you didn't agree. A thesis will also provide a roadmap for the paper. So in other words, it's going to tell your reader what to expect from the rest of the paper, from the body of your paper. It directly answers the question asked of you on a prompt question type scenario, or it directly responds to the description of the paper outlined on your paper assignment sheet. So if you're writing along, you're writing a working thesis, and then you go back and look at the paper 1 assignment sheet and you realize, oh gosh, I'm supposed to be writing a summary and response, but what I'm really writing here is an argumentative paper where I'm trying to argue that letter writing is a wonderful thing, right? So then you'll realize, oh, I missed the point here, because this first paper is not argumentative. Your job is not to argue letter writing is great, or etiquette is fabulous in a college classroom. But your job is to summarize the ideas of Derzik or Worthen and then to respond to them. So in that response part, you're agreeing or disagreeing, but the whole paper is not argumentative. So you've got to keep that in mind for paper one, that it's a little bit different. Remember that a thesis is an interpretation of a question or a subject. It's not, though, the subject itself. So the subject, for example, or the topic might be World War II, or it might be the Civil War, or it might be the novel Robinson Crusoe. A thesis statement is going to offer a way to understand the war or the novel. And so a thesis makes a claim that other people could disagree with or dispute, as I said before. So if you just present a statement that no one possibly could disagree with, then you haven't really written a thesis. So if your thesis is, one may argue that George Washington was the first president of the United States of America, then duh, that's not a claim that others could dispute. Everybody knows that that's a fact, right? So you haven't really written a thesis there. And normally the thesis is a single sentence located near the end, at the very end of your first paragraph, your introductory paragraph, that presents your argument to the reader. And then the rest of the paper, the body paragraphs, gathers and organizes evidence that persuades the reader of the logic of your thesis or your interpretation of the topic. So remember this, though, an effective thesis can be longer than just one sentence. It might be 2 sentences long. The thesis may not necessarily appear at the end of paragraph 1. So you may read some text where the thesis happens later. But for our purposes in a Comp 1 classroom, our thesis statements are always going to appear at the end of paragraph 1 because we want them to be very clear at this stage of writing. And also note that some very well-written papers and articles at more advanced levels contain what we call an implied thesis. So there may not be a sentence that lays out the thesis directly right in your face, but nevertheless you're going to get the main idea very clearly through that article. Again, for our purposes in a Comp 1 class, though, we want a very clear, direct thesis statement. So how do I arrive at a thesis? Well, it's the result of a thinking process that can be lengthy. So writing a thesis isn't the first thing you're going to do after you read the paper assignment. Before you develop an argument on any topic or an idea about your writing, you have to collect and organize the evidence. You have to look for possible relationships between known facts, such as a surprising contrast or similarity. You have to think about the significance of those relationships. And this is speaking generally, like in a persuasive paper or a research paper or an argumentative paper. With paper 1, what you have to do is go back and reread either Derzik or Worthen, whichever you're writing about. And you have to collect and organize the evidence that you're going to summarize and respond to. So the main claim that Derzik or Worthen is making, and then, 2 or 3 main supporting ideas that back up that main claim that they're making. And then your response to all of that. So once you do this initial thinking and sort of collecting and gathering and organizing some evidence there, then you probably can come up with what we call a working thesis. So a basic or main idea, an argument or an interpretation that you think you can probably support with evidence in the body of your paper, but it might need some adjusting along the way. So writers use all kinds of different techniques to stimulate their thinking there and to help them clarify a relationship or comprehend the broader meaning of a subject matter and arrive at a thesis. So you might want to brainstorm ideas with a tutor in the tutoring center or online with your classmates, with your friends, with your family. How do you know if your thesis is strong? Well, run it by me, or again, get help from a tutor. Now, you're going to definitely get help from me because I'm going to give you a lot of feedback when you submit your rough draft. So when you do that and you have your thesis, I'm going to give you some very direct feedback there. But even if, let's say hypothetically, you didn't have time to get advice elsewhere, you can do some thesis evaluation of your own that will help you. So when you're looking at your rough draft and your working thesis, ask yourself the following. Do I actually answer the question that's been asked of me on the assignment sheet if it's a prompt type situation? Or am I responding to the statement provided on my paper assignment sheet that describes this essay and its parameters and what it's supposed to do? So again, going back and rereading the assignment sheet, the prompt that's there, or the description that's there of the paper after you've constructed a working thesis can help you fix a problem where you've missed the focus of that assignment. And here's a really good effective technique for prompt situations, which you'll encounter a lot in college writing. When you're working with a prompt question, turn the question into an answer by regurgitating the question back in statement form in your thesis. And regurgitating is a fancy word that means vomiting it back up. Ew, I know, gross, sorry. So, for example, here's a prompt and a question. Write an argument essay on the subject of immigrant refugees. Should the United States welcome them? Why or why not? Well, to begin creating a thesis, just regurgitate that question back in the form of an answer or a statement. After careful research, one may see that the United States should or should not, depending on your position, welcome immigrant refugees into our country because, etc., right? So you might state one or two reasons very succinctly there in your thesis, and boom, you have a thesis. So that's a good little strategy to remember. Ask yourself, have I taken a position that others might challenge or oppose? So again, if your thesis is just stating a fact that nobody would or even could disagree with, then you're just maybe providing a summary rather than making an argument. Now in paper one, you are providing a summary and a response. So, part of your thesis is stating the main idea of the writer. And part of your thesis is responding. And that's the part where you are sort of raising a point that other people could disagree with in paper one. Ask yourself, is my thesis statement specific enough? So if it's too vague, if it's not specific, often it's not going to put forth a very strong argument or idea. So if you're using vague words that are too generalized, like thing, good, bad, people, great, beautiful, stuff, then ask yourself, how could I be more specific, and how could I elevate my language and make it feel more like college writing? So ask yourself, okay, what exactly is this thing that I'm talking about? Is it an issue? Is it an event? What is the thing? Why and how is it good or bad or great or beautiful? So is it healthy or unhealthy maybe? How is it good or bad? Is it beneficial or non-beneficial to society? Is it effective or not effective? Which people exactly are you referring to? So are they advocates or opponents? Are they readers maybe? Are they the elderly, or are they teens? Be as specific as you can be in your writing. And then, does my thesis pass the so what test? So if a reader reads your thesis and the first response is, well, so what? Why does this matter? Like, why do I give a flip about, whether or not there's etiquette in the classroom, or why should we care about the lost art of letter writing, then you probably need to clarify, to forge a relationship, to connect to a larger issue, to be more clear. Does my essay support my thesis specifically and without wandering? So here's a golden rule. You want to engrave this in gold letters on your brain here. So if your thesis and the body of your paper do not go together, one of them must change. Say that out loud with me. If your thesis and the body of your paper do not go together, one of them must change. So if you have a thesis statement that says one thing, and in the body of your paper you've contradicted what you said in your thesis, or vice versa, you're going to have to make some changes, right? If you lay out in your thesis a roadmap of what the paper is going to talk about, and then your paper doesn't follow the roadmap, something has to change, either the thesis or the body. And remember, it is perfectly okay, and in fact it's even good, to change as your knowledge is growing. So you might change the thesis statement, you might change the body of your paper to reflect ideas you're figuring out in the course of the writing process. So always reassess, always revise. Writing is a process, and this is important for us to learn. Then finally, ask yourself, does my thesis pass the how and why test? So if a reader reads your working thesis and says, well, how is this the case, or why? Then your thesis might be too broad, too open-ended. It might lack guidance. So see what you could add to maybe give the reader a better take on your main idea right from the beginning. So now let me give you some concrete examples. And again, this example that I'm going to give you is for a persuasive essay. So it's a bit different than this very first summary and response. Suppose you're writing a persuasive essay where your goal is to persuade the reader of something on the topic of the other. So that means this idea that people who are different from you are other, right? So they're sort of foreign, they're difficult to understand. And so the instructor gives you the following prompt on your paper assignment sheet. Take a position on whether or not an in-group, out-group mentality is healthy for society. Provide sources to support your argument and then refute the opposition. So, do some research, find some sources after you've taken your position, and then, offer the counter argument and then refute the opposition. Come back and say why they're wrong in their view. Respectfully, though, using ethos. So in-group, out-group is a mindset that sort of says, okay, well, I'm part of this group and you're part of that other group. So maybe I'm a conservative and you're a liberal, or I'm a liberal and you're a conservative. That's a good example since politics are so polarized at the moment. So your job is to research this idea of in-group, out-group and figure out where you stand on it. So you're kind of lazy and you're in a big hurry and you don't take the time to actually read any of the material your professor gave you. You don't do any research at all. You just sit down at the computer instead and you just start typing out a bunch of crap. Sorry, but that's what happens a lot of times. So here's what you type out. There are many reasons why an in-group, out-group mentality can be bad for society. Well, duh, right? That's a very weak thesis. It doesn't tell the reader anything except the idea that there are reasons why this way of thinking could be bad for humans. Well, the reader already knows that. The reader knows that there may also be reasons why it's good, but you haven't taken a position and you haven't told us anything. Also, bad is a vague, very generalized word that doesn't tell us anything. We don't know how it could be bad. So obviously you can and you should expand upon new information in the body of that essay, but it's important that the reader is receiving a very clear, solid professional thesis up front. So a reader of this weak thesis is going to think, well, so what? What are the reasons? Why should I agree? Why should I care? Why should I want to even read any further? Ask yourself the same tough questions as you're writing and start to do the hard work of actually buckling down and doing the research and looking at the ideas of experts concerning this question of whether or not designating people into groups is actually healthy. And as you start to read and research, you might consider facts like the science that shows that the human brain actually needs to categorize people, places, ideas, and events in order to make sense of them. And you might look at recent research studies that provide information on the way in which in-group, out-group mentality benefits evolution, supposedly, right? You might look at the overall morality of the situation on the other hand. So is it morally right to divide people up and just sort of stereotype them into groups, or to see oneself as superior to another just because they're part of one group and you're part of another group? So now you're starting to do the work. You're starting to really think critically and look at all sides and decide what you think by pushing your comparisons toward an interpretation. Why does this topic matter? What are its implications for human beings? How does it affect us as citizens, as individuals? So remember, A thesis can't just state a fact that we all know to be true. It's got to make a claim that others can dispute. So you look again at the evidence. You decide you're going to argue that maybe the in-group, out-group way of viewing the world is not healthy, and you revise your weak thesis. Though some feel that an us and them mentality is pre-programmed into the human brain, research into the topic reveals that this way of viewing the world leads to chaos, war, and unrest for our world. Now you have a pretty solid working thesis here. And included in it is a clear statement of your stance, your position on this issue, and some idea of how and why the two sides are disagreeing. So as you continue with your writing process and you're exploring the topic further, you'll probably start to characterize the differences more precisely, and then your working thesis may seem too vague to you. So maybe you'll decide now you need to add a second sentence to it to provide a roadmap for some of your main points and to completely clarify your position to your reader. So you end up revising that working thesis into a final thesis that really captures your argument. Though some feel that an us and them mentality is pre-programmed into the human brain due to evolutionary development processes and is therefore essential to our ability to function, research into the topic reveals that this way of viewing the world leads to chaos, war, and unrest for humankind. To truly evolve as humans in a world whose interactions are becoming more global, we must learn to view others, no matter how different they may seem, as equally deserving of rights, life, and liberty. Now compare that back to that original super weak thesis. This final thesis presents a way of interpreting the evidence, the meaning of it, right? That illuminates the meaning of the question in the first place. So keep in mind, this is just one way to interpret this question, this topic. It's not necessarily the one and only right answer. So this is one thing that really sort of rattles some people in an English composition, an English writing classroom, is the idea that there may not be one right answer, like in a math classroom, at least undergraduate math, most of it. There may not be one right answer. Rather, there may be only strong and weak thesis statements and strong and weak uses of evidence with many possible interpretations. So that's kind of an overview of generally writing a thesis statement. Now let's look at some generalized tips for organizing and writing an essay. So one of the first things you ask yourself as you begin to think about writing a college paper is, well, how do I best organize it? So it's not just the good old 5-paragraph essay anymore, folks, because we're starting out with shorter papers, but they're going to get longer. And you've got to get that 5-paragraph mentality out of your head. So traditionally, we organize papers in the following way. We have our introductory paragraph that begins with a hook. And then we start broad and we narrow into the thesis. And that thesis appears as the last sentence or two of paragraph 1. Then we have the body paragraphs that present our main points, that provide evidence to support our thesis. And if we're writing an argumentative paper, then we're going to include the counter argument and the rebuttal there as well. Then we have the conclusion, where we're summing up our main ideas in new wording. Very important. And so we're going to save some significant insight or thought for that conclusion because we don't want to bore the reader. So we might revisit the hook in the conclusion. We might use what's called the bookend technique, where maybe you begin with an anecdote or a little factoid, and then you come back and revisit that in your conclusion. Here are some important tips to remember, though, about organization. So again, generally speaking, with most college papers, you'll begin with a hook. We won't be doing that for summary and response. Rather, we just like right in because it's a shorter, more succinct paper. So we like right in our first sentence mentioning the title and the author's full name, right? But normally we start with a hook. An opening line that hooks the reader in, that reels the reader in, that makes the reader want to keep reading. And that's something in songwriting that we use as well. The hook is usually a line that's repeated, generally in the chorus, to hook the listener in. So effective hooks might be a question, but if you use a question, don't use second person you. Did you ever wonder why letter writing is important? So you don't want to do that because that brings your writing down to a high school level. So you might rather use a statement that is interesting and that is more broad. You could use a quote that's relevant, maybe a brief anecdote, but you want to avoid anything that's trite or overused, like throughout history or from the beginning of time. You know, you're writing a 2-page paper here to start out with. You can't have the whole history of the world in there. Your first paragraph should then continue by introducing the subject and then at the end of it, presenting your thesis. So ask yourself, what does the reader need to know right away? So if you're analyzing a text or if you're responding to it, like we're doing in this first paper, you're going to make sure in your intro that you have the title correctly punctuated, in this case in quotation marks, that you have the full name of the writer, and that you have, your writer's main idea, and then your basic thesis statement, how you're responding to the writer's idea. So remember, it's a smart strategy to start broad at the beginning of your paper and narrow into the thesis statement. Here's an example of that. Most of us have experienced situations that seem challenging, but not everyone has lived through the violence, war, destruction, and devastation of a totalitarian regime. Moreover, notice there's a transition word. Few of those who have survived such tragedies are able to translate their grief into a vivid, poignant memoir that allows courage and truth to shine through its pages, pointing the reader toward the kind of bravery that uplifts us all. After a thorough read of an excerpt from Azar Nafisi's acclaimed book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, one may see that Nafisi creates an effective, moving account that transports readers into a different world, allowing them to step into the shoes of the other. So in this example, we start broad with this hook that says, you know what, most everyone has experienced something that seems really challenging, but not many of us have lived through violence and war and destruction and devastation of a regime, right? So it's a broad statement that pretty much everyone is going to think of as being true to them. And then we have that transition. Moreover, few of those who've survived such tragedies can translate their grief into this beautiful memoir that uplifts us, right? So now we're narrowing. We're getting closer to the thesis. We're saying, okay, so a few of us may have lived through something like that, but few of those who've actually lived through it can translate this kind of tragedy, the survival of it, into a text that is so beautifully written. And then we narrow into the thesis itself. After a thorough read of an excerpt from Azar Nafisi's acclaimed book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, and that title is italicized because it's the title of a long work, a book, one may see that she creates an effective, moving account. So notice you didn't say, you may see, or I argue that. You said one may see, thus elevating the language. So that's an example of a situation where the paper assignment sheet would have been to analyze this reading by Azar Nafisi. So staying with that same example, the body paragraphs have to establish the supporting points that validate the main claim you're making in your thesis. And so if we look at that above example as a case in point, we see that the body paragraphs are going to have to support the idea that Azar Nafisi has written a piece that is vivid, it's realistic, it's effective, and it's moving. So we need evidence for those claims. Those are the 4 main points, right, that'll be outlined in the body. So what sentences in Nafisi's story show the use of vivid details? What sections use language that feels realistic? What exactly makes this memoir effective? What portions maybe appeal on an emotional level to us? Pathos. We need to quote from those sections in a normal paper of this kind so our readers see the evidence for our claims in order to establish our own logos, logic, and ethos, credibility. So then we have the conclusion, that final paragraph in which you sum up or restate your thesis in brand new Wording, make sure you get that. Do not repeat your thesis word for word in the conclusion. That is terribly boring to your reader, and it feels like high school or middle school writing. Do not do that. Restate your thesis in all new wording. Offer some final thought or insight. So now we've said that the summary and response is different in certain ways than the generalized rules that we've just gone over for thesis statements. So let me give you a beginning template, an example of how a thesis for paper 1 might look. Through a close summary and response of blank, so you would insert the title there in quotations, you can't talk to your professor like this, or the other piece, depending on which you choose to write about, by, and then you would insert the author's name, Eva Derzik or Molly Worthen. One may see that the use of blank, blank, and blank allows the writer to create an effective text. So now you've laid out 3 main points that you're going to summarize and then you're going to respond to. So you need to go back and look at Derzik or look at Worthen and see what are the main points that this writer is making, and maybe how did she make them. So here's an example. Through a close summary and response of an excerpt from Azar Nafisi's reading Lolita in Tehran, one may see that the use of vivid details, realistic dialogue, and pathos allows the writer to create an effective text. So those may be some of the things that you respond to, or you may actually find main supporting points from Derzik or Worthen that you're going to respond to. So why the lost art of letter writing should matter, what it does for us, right? What its benefits are, why etiquette in a classroom matters, why you can't talk to your professor like this, what the benefits of not doing that would be, right? So remember, go back and look at that, what is a summary and response and how should I organize it sheet to make sure you're on track there. And I'll be giving you examples and sample papers that will also be really helpful. But don't confuse a topic with a thesis. Remember, gun control or abortion, that's a topic. But to turn that into a thesis, we have to ask ourselves, so what about gun control? What about abortion, right? And again, I'm talking generally speaking with an argumentative paper, which is generally what you'll be writing. So here's a weak thesis. Gun control is a controversial topic in American society today. Well, duh, that's a fact. Every reader in the world knows it. It's not a debatable claim. No one can argue with you. It only discusses the topic. It doesn't offer any opinion on it, any reason to interpret it. Here's a strong thesis. After thoroughly researching the topic of gun control, one may argue that imposing rigid laws mandating citizens' rights concerning weapons contradict the foundational principles of the American Constitution. Now you've made a debatable claim about the topic of gun control with which other people can disagree. You might decide that you feel that the opposite of that is true, and you might make the opposing claim, which is perfectly fine. There's no right answer there. There's only weak and strong thesis statements and weak and strong evidences that support your thesis. So I hope that this is helpful. Remember, you can come back and watch this video at any point along the way as we're moving through the semester and you want to refresh your memories on the basic general rules for writing a thesis. But this first paper, in terms of organizing and all that, will be just a little bit different. Thanks for your patience.